So, we've made it to Season 4. The show has just completed its biggest season yet, and the characters are settling into their modern roles. So what's the show's next goal, especially with a new captain at the helm? There's some ideas there, a hint at what's to come, but for now, the show is taking it easy. We're coming off of a much more eventful and emotional season. Let's give the characters a fun little breather. What kind of an identity do you give to Season 4? What ties it all together? There's a lot of different answers you could give. One could say it was a season of experimentation and off-the-wall ideas. Let's see what the Louds would be like if they got stranded on a desert island for a couple of days. Let's have the kids do an imaginative little relay story during a blackout and use some of our sillier ideas. A fake apocalypse sounds like a unique take on a Halloween special. Hell, let's do a Walt-focus episode. It's clear that they wanted to have a little fun and do whatever while figuring things out. You could also call it an inoffensive season. Outside of one critical fumble, it had a much happier atmosphere. No other moments that lit the viewer base on fire. Maybe it's the chill interlude between Season 3's emotional plots and Season 5's big age-up. A sort of calm before the storm, with an emphasis on lower stakes plots and ideas. But it can be best described as the show's transitional season. Multiple episodes build towards that age-up, and we see the last gasps of Savino-era elements, while the Rubiner-era essentials plant their seeds. The staff had ideas in mind after Savino's departure, but were figuring it out as they went. The transitional nature of the season led to us having a sort of smorgasbord of plots and ideas. No particular plot or structure dominates the season. Outside of the disclusion of Season 1 era sibling fights, Season 4 gives you a healthy mix of everything the show has done thus far. We got loads of Season 2-esque sibling group antics and Clink and McCloud stories, but also the more modern Dog Squad or Sister-Sister plots, with even the occasional side character spotlight. No matter which era of the show you prefer, there's something in this season you're bound to like. Unfortunately, we get a reduced episode count this time around, and just one special in contrast to the 4 in Season 3. But as we mentioned last time, this is due to the spin-off, the Casa Grandes, claiming 10 of the episode's 52 episode slots to host its pilot episodes. That show was to air later that year, and they likely wanted to get kids invested in the Casa Grande family. While this wasn't a major impact on the show, it's still evident that some characters had their focus screen time slightly reduced, as there just was less of it to go around. Going along with the chill and relaxed mood, Season 4 places most of its episodes during the second semester, which typically starts in January or February, and many of which have that springtime, near the end of the school year feel. We're building up toward an age-up. Lori has several episodes involving her preparations for college, and Lincoln and his friends are going to be starting a new school year next season. Placing this season before summer break makes a lot of sense, and in general it gives us a very warm and anticipatory feel. These episodes explicitly back this up. A Pimple Plan and Washed Up give the viewer a direct look at the calendar, showing that they take place in late March and late April respectively. Early semester events include championship hockey, the NFL's NFC Championship game, a Valentine's Day dance, and taking things to the spring, Huggins mentions how hot the weather's been in A Grave Mistake, Luna mentions finals in her diary. 2 separate episodes depict severe thunderstorms that only occur in warm weather. We even got a trio of end-of-the-year class trips, 2 of them involving beaches, heavily associated with spring break. And who doesn't have fond memories of April or May school trips to the amusement park in elementary or middle school, or perhaps for a club event? It really comes together to form that aura of excitement you get as the weather starts to get warmer, especially as a kid. Quite fittingly, given the time of year, this season was very much in love. A good amount of plots either about romance or it being a simple catalyst for hijinks. Our main cast has many different experiences with finding new love or furthering existing romances, even if some of them wouldn't become lasting. And despite being a potentially heavy topic, this season keeps in character, leaning it on the more light-hearted side. And if it's another thing this season is very much in love with, it's plots about or involving animals. Despite a change in their behavior that we'll discuss later, the writers are really realizing their potential for gags and fun moments. With this being a transitional era for the show, we're naturally going to get a mix of both showrunners' styles and the elements that they both bring to the franchise. Savino's staples take their final bows here, We get a couple of comic strip references, but at this point they're sparse. Luna makes a few musical references, but they're drastically reduced. Ace Savvy gets its last spotlight as a major part of the show. It's basically never referenced these days outside of crossover games. And we still get a few gags aimed at parents, but these out-of-pocket moments are becoming extremely rare. While there have definitely been some small tweaks to the humor here and there, the show's joke style has generally remained consistent throughout its run. While we don't have any of those "wow, they really went there" moments anymore, the show still sticks to its guns and does it well. This consistency in the style is a consequence of its target audience and audience retention. If we compare it to the often compared show The Simpsons, that show's generally written with a long-term adult audience in mind, and has had different writers and showrunners over the years. They know that they need to keep the humor fun but fresh for this adult audience, and to sometimes subvert expectations. The Real Gems use Homer the Smithers as an excellent example of this. The audience knows by that point that Homer's going to get chosen, let's put a lampshade on it. The Loud House, meanwhile, uses a more evergreen style of humor, and is written with a more short-term kid audience in mind. And while they do have adult fans, they know that most of their audience is made up of children who come and go, so they don't need to look to change things up all that often to keep the target demographic on their toes. But that's not to say that the humor doesn't have trend or variation within itself. This is pretty trivial, but one thing I've noticed while rewatching this season is that it really loves its costume gags. Characters are often dressing up as others for humor or to serve as a plot point, with everyone believing they're messy and unconvincing imitations despite showing visible suspicion. And if they aren't imitating another character, they're going for crappy disguises or just silly get-ups in general. If there's something that's really changed in the transition, it's the element of fantasy versus reality. Not to a huge degree, but definitely to the point where a change is noticeable. Some episodes still go with the Savino method. Remember that zombie apocalypse I was talking about? Turns out it was all the result of a storm evacuation, and the so-called zombies were Lincoln and Clyde's exhausted parents. And flip. Others, though few, go for the magic is real approach of Season 5 onward. Looks like that lake monster turned out to be real after all. And then there's the rat beast in Tales of Woe, which acts as a sort of middle ground between the two. A two-tailed rat can happen via birth defects, but not by being doused in chemicals like old corn chip here. But even if the door to fantasy is slowly creeping open, the writers are still using these elements sparingly. They aren't yet the focus of entire plots. If you want something that's always remained consistent, even now, it's the layout of the house itself. This is something I should have brought up like 2 videos ago, but the house has an official blueprint thanks to the online web game Livin' Loud, Lincoln's List. Both floors have fixed layouts. It sticks to this no matter what. In contrast to a home like The Simpsons, where a more loose layout will change a few things around to make for a better gag or set piece. It even has Lynn and Rita's room as that one room in the house we almost never see, just like the Rumpus room, albeit one that never gets periodically sealed up. It's actually that one room you see the door to in the show's iconic couch shots, but it's almost never lit up. Speaking of the living room, the layout's consistent, but we do see the background objects within change according to the needs of a plot or gag. Some episodes depict it with a computer, sometimes with a birdcage, or a lamp and table. A little bit of trivia, but it's interesting nonetheless. The only major inconsistency is the presence or absence of Lisa's bomb shelter in the backyard. Sometimes it depends on the plot. They could have easily solved the conflict of Room and Hoard if they had just remembered to store their things in there. This season also keeps a good eye on continuity, picking up where Season 3 left off, and even provides little details for those who have seen the previous episodes. Present tense and Room and Hoard call back to Lynn Sr.'s adoration for silly ties that we were introduced to in The Ties That Bind. Clyde's seen giving the morning announcements, showing that he's continuing his duties as junior administrator from Absent Minded. Principal Huggins loses his toupee in several episodes as a running gag. Then, in Tough Cookies, it's shown that he's had enough and glued it to his head. Remember Flip's gross meat mauler from last season? Now he's got a whole jar full of them stowed away on the boat he rented out to the Louds. These little details typically aren't story critical, but good callbacks and consistency for those who pay attention to the finer details and world building. A nice little bonus in its own right. Speaking of world building, at this point our characters are starting to settle into their modern status quo, things that will typically be their go-to loadout for their future focus episodes. Lincoln opted to continue his track record from last season. He's still the master of persuasion, the idea guy, the effective leader who stiffs up for others, and always has a backup plan. His episodes mostly focus on his friendships, which will become his status quo going forward. Plenty of episodes with the Dog Squad, and a surprising amount of Clink and McCloud plots, but still gets some family bonding moments in the mix, and even when he isn't the focus, he's still moving the plot along in smaller ways, or acting as the co-star to another sibling. We even get little details like his continued use of his riff hardcore skills. Some targeted slapstick he got last season is still there, but it is much toned down. The show has gotten better at spreading it around to other characters. Though if it's one thing that hasn't been in his favor this season, it's a sudden tendency to make uncharacteristic and irresponsible mistakes at the expense of others, like serving chicken nuggets to Ricky the Rooster's funeral, or sabotaging the parent-teacher conferences out of fear of getting a bad report. Remember, he's a good student, he had little reason to think that would happen. One episode that sort of zigzags this would be one of his focus episodes, Friends in Dry Places. Lincoln is telling Lynn about the upcoming 5th grade class trip to Michigan's Gold Coast, second only to Cyrodiil's. Reprising her mentoring role for middlemen, she warns Lincoln that once middle school begins, his friends will start to drift apart, something that ultimately happened to her. Lincoln vows that this would never happen, but upon arrival he discovers that the bunkmates are pre-assigned. All of his friends are separated and seem to be gelling very well with their bunkmates. They even default on their agreement to go sand boogie boarding together. The different members of the group are starting to deviate, culminating in Rusty briefly forgetting Lincoln's name, a negative sign that Lynn explicitly mentioned. Convinced that the group is falling apart, he goes to Clyde, who believes in his plight, and the two plan to sign the whole group up for a hike in the dunes, by crossing their names off their preferred activities. And to nobody's surprise, they're miserable in the heat. Lincoln stages a gotten lost situation to reinforce the group's teamwork, but they catch wind of the plan and start to splinter for real. But a rescue operation and a little help from Cheryl bring the Dog Squad back online. There's a lot to unpack here. Clearly, Lincoln was in the wrong for trying to force his friends in a certain direction. It's okay to want to try new things, but at the same time, ditching your plans for last-second, in-the-moment jaunts would make anyone understandably upset, especially when one of your supposedly close friends forgets your fucking name. As we saw in Antiqued Off last season, the group isn't the best at communicating their feelings. Lincoln should have had a chat with the group before the trip about what Lynn had said to him, but at the same time, the group should have agreed to do at least one activity together, especially with their friendship on the line. Either way, there's no need to worry about them. Their group's gonna be A-okay. Clyde decided to run with the season's theme and keep things a little more chill. His neuroticism has been way toned down. No calls to Dr. Lopez. Still excitable, but more level-headed, even playing the role of the sane man to his parents sometimes. Their overprotectiveness has kicked into overdrive, to the point of tying him to a tree, showing that not only have they not learned from Snow Way Down, but even when they do learn to give him more freedom, they do it by spying on him. No idea how they let him go to astronaut camp. This is actually the second time he got a focus episode based on the name Change of Heart. How about that? His specialty in cooking and baking has definitely given him a reputation at this point, and deception still makes his stomach hurt. Even if this detail wasn't always taken into account, wanting to escape astronaut camp and wait it out by hiding in Liam's barn. He even gets a romance plot centering around the Valentine's Day dance, with his crush ultimately being unrequited, but finding a connection to another girl and salvaging the events. He's gotten much more mature and is really coming to his own. And then there's his former crush, who's become the exemplary character of the season's transitional nature. She's got the biggest change coming up of any character. She's going to college. Lori thus spent the season preparing for her next chapter. She works alongside her father at Lynn's table, ultimately turning out to be a skilled manager after the mishaps in the other roles, even if Kotaro gave her terrible advice. She wanted to get in plenty of bonding with her father before she leaves, and wants to do the same thing with her friends after seeing some kind of High School Musical knockoff. She tries a little too hard and ultimately makes amends after loads of mishaps, including the pepper challenge. It was no Mississippi Queen, but she clearly looks stoned. She goes through even more mishaps in an attempt to earn money for a college car, and ends up buying Mr. Grouse's old car, willing to settle for something not quite as glamorous as she wanted, but still nice. And most importantly, she takes a visit to her dream school at Fairway University, calling back to the scholarship she earned last season, and despite some self-doubt, she ultimately decides to commit, setting herself up towards achieving her dreams. Though one girl's dream can be another girl's nightmare. Like Lincoln, Lenny's afraid of losing those close to her in the transition, as she and Lori have had a close bond since they were kids, and ends up attempting to sabotage Lori's visit by pretending to be her. She makes things right in the end, but while her fear was understandable, it was uncharacteristic of her to take it this far. At least she didn't cause the bird problem. Thankfully, though, the rest of the season has her stay true to herself, and we get a little of everything she has to offer. She also continues her progress at Reininger's. Last season she proves to be an effective employee, now she's chosen to be the manager for a weekend while Mrs. Carmichael is away. Unlike their boss, who's proven to be unreasonable, Lenny wants their work to be both fun and productive, and wants to be both a good boss and a friend at the same time. She ultimately has to take a more rigid stance when the senior shopaganza comes roaring in, and while she felt bad about calling her friends back from their dream lunch, they understood and reassured her. And this isn't her only moment of brilliance. She and Lincoln team up on Double Dare to take on an unusually antagonistic Lisa, and shows a lot of prowess in both the physical and mental challenges. Though she can still be a ditz sometimes, and often doesn't get the memo, she's only continuing to grow, and she'll need it. When Lori moves out, she'll be the oldest and most responsible sibling. Those are big shoes to fill. Luna decided to take things easy after a very eventful Season 3. She agrees to babysit the McBride's cats while they're at a family picnic, complete with oversized manual, and it ends up being a fiasco, so she enlists Sam's help to deal with them. One of the few instances where her knowledge of animals actually comes into play. She also fakes a night of debauchery and snoops on after she catches wind of Lincoln, Lenny, and Luan reading her diary. She even plays a heartfelt song for Ricky the Rooster's funeral. Overall, much more of a backseat role, but some much needed low-key moments to recharge her batteries. Luan's relationships are key this time around. First and foremost, no April Fool's Day episode to assassinate her character this time. Hooray! Second, we get to learn some surprising things about her this time around. She apparently has an innate talent for cooking when she's forced to take it as an elective, and Lynn Sr. takes it as an opportunity to both help his daughter and bond with her more, only to take it too far, wanting her to eventually take over Lynn's table, causing a lot of tension and eventually making amends. Either way, these two have been goofballs and made puns to each other in the past, but we get to see how much natural chemistry the two have. It runs in the family. Speaking of goofballs, these two took their next step. Last season they realized their feelings and now they're having their first date. Their relationship has been healthy, but a surprise pimple on the day of said date leads to great paranoia from Luan, enlisting her family in increasingly crazy ways to get rid of it. And Benny takes no issue with it when it's ultimately exposed. A low stakes and happy ending, but a plot that shows she still has some self-esteem issues deep down. You can kind of see this weird mental state through Mr. Coconuts, who she has sort of a split personality with. Luan gives him his own personality. We even see that he has a bit of a life of his own, but he also tends to act as a more honest and straightforward side to Luan's personality as the two converse. Lynn had one of the most active seasons this time around, with sports and relationships tying things together. Good Sports has to be one of her best moments in the series, where she and Mr. Grouse develop a friendship over their mutual love of the Detroit Lions, and the two watch their championship game together, having a brief wedge in their friendship when they learn that they support different sides of a heated baseball rivalry, but learn to have fun despite the differences. It's a sweet episode that continues what 11 Louds a Leapin' started. This episode also shows a surprising attention to detail towards the NFL, while at the same time missing some critical details. Lynn correctly mentions that the Detroit Lions haven't been to the NFC Championship game in over 20 years, though they did not make it back during the year this episode originally aired. That wouldn't happen until about 5 years later, where they would go on to lose to the 49ers. And the year after that, well, sorry about that. Thanks for giving us a home NFC Championship game. Anyway, Luna also mentions a halftime show, and those big performance shows only happen during the Super Bowl. The most notable thing, though, is that this episode uses the older logos and color scheme for the Lions instead of the more modern design. Nick's gotten very cushy with the NFL in recent years, with NFL Slime Time in their game simulcasts, even getting last year's Super Bowl when Paramount got the rights to the game. Lincoln's even announced the MVP winners. That poor kid had to give an award to Dak Prescott. I don't know if it's an organization thing or a budget thing, but with how close the two have become, it's shocking that they weren't able to just use the modern imagery from Mr. Grouse's sports den. He may be old, but he's more than enough of a sports fanatic to keep his stuff up to date. Also, while we're on the subject of the NFL, Lynn mentions that Margot's cousin predicted that the Jacksonville Jaguars are going to win the title. What? The Jaguars sucked that year. They were 6-10, last in their division. She would get another sports story in On Thin Ice, where her superstitions go into overdrive when her favorite hockey team has a shot at the championships. These, of course, get pretty extreme, and it ultimately results in her getting kicked out, and coincidentally having another sports-related bonding moment with Mr. Grouse. He too got kicked out for buying fake tickets from Flip. No use of Tucker's Ticks and Tucks, oddly enough. Either way, she learned from her favorite player to tone things down, and that unpredictability is what makes these games fun. What she also learns this season is what it's like to be a third wheel. Lynn gets a romance plot. All of her friends have suddenly started dating, even if these dates never return in later episodes, and become rather overbearing about it, and it ultimately forces Lynn to try and find a boyfriend just to fit in with her group. While Lynn's aggressive behavior really didn't help her case, at the same time I did feel bad for her in that the universe is basically conspiring against her. Loads of couples themes events popping up left and right in her favorite things. Thankfully, she and Dexter ultimately come to a friendly understanding. As for her friends though, she should have asked for a few solids in return for all this. This is the point where Lucy's episodes started to center around the Morticians Club and their adventures almost exclusively, and both of these focus episodes drive a wedge between her and the club, then mending things later. Thinking about it, this season did this with a lot of friend groups. Even relaxed scenarios can have their thorns. Anyway, Sandcastles is about a third grade trip to the beach, something the club attempts to get out of due to hating the sun, only for Lucy and Fangs to start enjoying the activities and eventually convincing the rest to do so as well, after briefly being shunned for her dishonesty. Meanwhile, in a grave mistake, Bertrand, the club's leader, is moving away, and he selects Haiku as his successor. Lucy believes she deserves it more, and puts it up to a vote, convincing half of the club to vote for her, breaking the tie in a silly way, ultimately causing the club to dissolve after bad leadership and a funeral gone wrong. She eventually agrees to a co-leadership position with her best friend, and ultimately saves the day. What makes this episode so interesting is that it's a sort of reverse of Head Poet's anxiety from the last season. This time, Lucy is the one experiencing jealousy over the accomplishment of another. Also, for some reason, we see Mazzy in the elementary school audience at the funeral. This definitely raises some questions. Lana was actually one of our big winners this time around. I genuinely forgot about this until I rewatched the season since her focus is otherwise so spread out. She got 4 major episodes just like Lori did, so she was easily a thumbnail candidate, but Lori was chosen instead since she ultimately represented the transitional nature of the season. Regardless, she's definitely proven to be one of the more versatile members of the main cast. She gets 2 episodes where she co-stars with her brother, one of which brings back her love of racing, and another where she develops a shared interest in him in video games. One of her most notable episodes this time around was A Mud Above, where a classmate's razzing and desire to prove her wrong leads her to attempting to train Charles to be fancy for a big dog show. A role reversal from Toads and Tiaras. Lana fails and Lola trains Charles for her, leading to Charles acting cold to her and unwilling to do their usual antics until she comes around. Much better execution than Toads and Tiaras, and doesn't put cracks in his Aesop. In that episode, Lana was clearly in on it and agreed to do the contest to get a prize for both of them, while here, Lana forced Charles into it to prove something to a snob, something only she wanted, so her being the lesson learner and having the blame makes much more sense. One thing this season really loved to do was explore the twin dynamic, getting the two of them involved in each other's plots to varying degrees. This even culminated in an outing where the two would switch places to get out of each other's unwanted obligations, which later came back to bite them. Our other half of the duo does get some nice outings, but not the same degree of focus. She gets 2 separate episodes about using someone who genuinely likes her to to get ahead in her pageant and show business career, coming to regret it later and ultimately doing the right thing, putting friendship above status. Though, in the case of A Star Is Scorned, she did have legitimate grievances when the director kept pushing her out of her own ads to focus on Lily's cuteness. She was clearly treating her poorly in the role she was promised. Nonetheless, it's nice to see Lola continuing to grow and make a legitimate friend of her own, introducing her to other members of her class that share mutual interests, helping her feel more at home in her new school. Lisa didn't quite take things so easy this season. She apparently gets grants from the Norwegian government. I guess her connection to the Institute really went a long way. And then there's her performance in the Double Dare competition, even building a robot to act as her partner. But she does get a proper focus episode in Geriatrics, one that effectively mixes her love of science and growing humanity and emotional attachment. We see just how strong her bond is with Pop Pop, and she starts to worry about how he won't be around forever. She immediately looks for solutions, from a heavily curated diet to a body regulatory suit that's very fragile and requires a long charging time. She gets a little carried away, and Pop Pop brings her back to Earth. What good is a long life if you can't enjoy it? Lisa ultimately agrees and the two have fun together, and Lisa's gonna be okay for quite a while. Pop Pop may be old, but remember that he's extremely healthy and athletic. He's not kicking the bucket anytime soon. The writers now have a good idea of what they want Lily to be. She's starting to show some real agency now. Lisa even knows that she's much smarter than she looks. Any Given Sunday gives us a story told from her perspective, which includes a deep dive into her imagination, and showed her attempting to take control of the situation so that all would be well. We have another use of her shit gag, but this time it's used strategically in order to get her parents to stop Vanzilla at the Food and Fuel. Have as much ice cream as you want, Lily. You've earned it. Lynn and Rita were probably hit the hardest by the reduction in episode count, which makes sense from the perspective of a kids show, but they still got their dues. A nice change is that they're much more assertive, willing to discipline their children if it comes down to it instead of putting themselves beneath them. Lynn's focus once again was directed toward his cooking career. We got to meet his mentor and the origins of his iconic recipes, along with 2 separate episodes about getting one of his children involved with his profession. Outside of the kitchen, we even get a wholesome story about his kids trying to find him the perfect birthday present. It's also the season where his emotional side became notably exaggerated, but thankfully it has no effect on his competence as a father. But it's definitely in character for Nickelodeon. They love their funny dad characters. His wife, meanwhile, undoubtedly got the least amount of focus, but still made a major milestone in her single focus episode of the season. She's offered a job as a columnist at a local newspaper, and she puts on the facade of a perfect family to impress her boss and provide backing for her parenting column. Unsurprisingly, the kids cannot behave themselves and everyone accepts that it's just how things are, and that families are not perfect, even if she was nearly fired for the mess her kids made at Jean Juan's. In fact, the kids in general suffer a regression to maturity here, much like Rita her rights, going full-on pigsty mode. This happened twice in Rita episodes in back-to-back seasons. That's kind of funny. Not much has changed for our secondary cast. We get plenty from our usual suspects, and many of them get their dues for the roles they play. But if it's one thing that's evident, is that the show loves its quirky adult characters. Flip and Mr. Grouse are obvious, the writers are having fun with Huggins, and we're seeing more frequent appearances of Scoots, and occasionally Mrs. Bernardo too. In fact, we see a bunch of them together during the fundraiser in Deep Cuts. It's definitely telling when you're chosen as the go-to in situations like this. Fitting to the season, Mr. Grouse has played a smorgasbord of different roles that he's had throughout the show's run. We still have him yelling at his neighbors from time to time, but often for more understandable reasons. Not to mention loads of smaller moments where the writers wanted to use one of their quirky adults. But we also get to learn a little more about him, meeting his late wife and seeing just how much football means to him because of it. We even get to see the car he used to woo her back in the day, happily passing it down to Lori in exchange for $500, and a summer of being his personal driver. He's really established himself as a show staple by this point, having come a long way from his days as a one-note gag character. And much of the same could definitely be said about Flip, and like his John DiMaggio counterpart, we get a mix of major and minor roles for him. This is the point where the writers made him a go-to staple, which was definitely a divisive decision with the fanbase. We get to see what he looked like as a teenager, where he was slim and suave, but still the slimy bastard we all know and love. The food and fuel by this point has become one of the show's most visited locations, and Old Flip still continues to sell various services to the main characters, including a crappy boat that briefly gets the Loud stranded on Lake Eddie. We even get to see the Loud kids be forced to take care of him in secret after accidentally injuring him, and how he, to nobody's surprise, takes advantage of it, even having them put on his own crappy sitcom version of the show. But he does tell Lynn and Rita to take it easy on their children after the fact, so he still has some heart. Either way, given the way things are going, expect to see a lot of Flip in your future. If it's someone else we're going to be seeing a lot of in the future, it's certainly the Dog Squad. Stella's now settled into the group, and we learn that she has quite a knack for contraptions. We also get to meet their parents and stall monitor, many of whom would become recurring characters in the future. They're an enduring presence in Lincoln's episodes, even some of which that are primarily Clink and McCloud, or otherwise. And despite a bump or two in the road, they always have each other's backs. Liam in particular is starting to get a lot of incidental use. We often see him pop up in stories that he otherwise has no involvement with. It's evident that he provides a benefit to the writers. If a plot or gag needs animals or farm-fresh products, he's very useful for being able to meet that demand, and his connection to our main character means that it's easy to bring him into the action. As mentioned earlier, Walt got a focused episode this time around, with the other pets acting as his wingmen to help him find love. This was their last major outing as a group until Season 7, but they made the most of it. Ultimately, they help Walt find love with a migrating duck, but the two decide it's best they stay with their respective families. What makes this episode so notable, though, is that it exemplifies the growing anthropomorphism of the show's animals, which really became apparent this season, the only real exceptions being the occasional lapses for a particular plot or gag. There's so many examples that it's hard to keep track of them all. Lovebirds alone has a ton. Mr. Grouse calls out Walt like he would any other member of the Loud family, and Lincoln mentions that Walt never misses an episode of the Dreamboat. Kinda like Woodstock and Peanuts, the anthropomorphism of a canary just isn't questioned and this scene is perfectly normal. And that's not even getting into the moments where Lola serves tea to a hummingbird, or Lisa casually losing a game of chess to an owl. We even see him with 5 o'clock Shadow in his disheveled, depressed state. I guess that's just how birds deal with heartbreak. Wait, that house looks different. Did Lincoln just forget to pick up his old house from school? Speaking of school, Royal Woods Elementary certainly didn't get to relax like everyone else. Mrs. Johnson has to host parent-teacher conferences, and things go absolutely haywire. And throwing back to what would Lincoln do once again, the overbearing mother we learned about in this episode makes an appearance, and it's revealed that she makes her do yoga, a practice she usually shirks on and ultimately has Rusty do for a bit in her place. She apparently owns a white sedan too, just more evidence as to how lonely she is. At least from my childhood, I noticed that a lot of single teachers had sedans. Either way, at least she didn't leave her lights on. Moving up the ladder, Cheryl's gotten more wild, but not much else to say there. And then there's Principal Huggins. Aside from his toupee gags having to accept the loss of Ricky the Rooster, the superintendent is back, and he has Clyde bake butterscotch cookies for her to appeal to her sweet tooth. They clearly want to do something Skinner-esque with him. Hopefully this keeps up. And that's the gist of Season 4. A lot of unique ideas to offer, being a nice breather while the operation changes hands. There were definitely some cracks, and some of the more major criticisms of modern Loud House have their roots planted here. But overall, it was a very successful transition of eras. It knew to feel things out without being disruptive, and just let loose and have some good fun. It still has its fair share of apology endings and lessons learned, but it knew, for the most part, to keep the stakes low and avoid wearing out the show's audience. It really hits home that anticipatory feel of the last couple of months of the school year, something that many of us experienced at one point or another. How do you feel about that Season 4 feel? What are your favorite moments? Let me know in the comments and get ready to pack your bags. We're going to Scotland.